We are truly honored to have representatives from the Chinese-Canadian military veterans and the Tuskegee here today, along with community and campus guests. On a personal note, my father was a World War II veteran, and if he were still alive today, I would be sharing this event with him. We are videotaping this historic event. This event will be captured on video and posted on the Irving K. Barber Learning Center's website in the near future. And in this way, we hope the stories shared today will live on and be accessed by others who could not join us today. If you have time later this morning, I would also encourage you to visit the Wallace B. Chung and Madeline H. Chung collection in this building, down the corridor. The Chung collection is a designated national treasure containing more than 25,000 artifacts related to BC history, immigration, and settlement. Dr. Chung is here today and attending the event is here with us today, and if you have some time, please do visit this impressive collection containing many of his treasures. So it's just down the corridor to the left, and you have to go through our special collections area. This event is proudly presented by the Chapman Learning Commons, named after Mrs. Chapman, her husband Dr. Lloyd Chapman. Their contribution to UBC has fostered group interaction and the use of learning technologies available on the third level of this building in the Learning Commons. Perhaps most importantly, the Chapmans believe that people learn best when engaged in discussion, sharing ideas and insights with one another. I can't think of a more fitting event to honor the spirit of the Chapmans and to provide a gathering space for learning and connecting. And now I'll turn it over to Don Chapman.
Thank you, Gordon. And yes, this is something my parents would be very proud of, because they always believed in education and enlightenment. And there is nothing more that will say that more than these two groups. We have two people I would like to very quickly recognize. On behalf of the U.S. Consulate, Ann Callahan, Joe Salazar, the Assistant Principal Officer of the U.S. Consulate. You're here, if you wouldn't mind just saying a word or two. Thank you.
Good morning. It is such a great pleasure to welcome you as we kick off this weekend full of exceptional events, celebrating the life and work of two groups who played such an important role in the history of our two great nations. And I note in particular the fact that we are celebrating the birthdays of both of those great nations next week. The Tuskegee Airmen and the Chinese-Canadian veterans. It's no overstatement to say that we are in the presence of living legends. We salute you, and we are humbled by being with you today. A warm welcome to all the veterans with us today, and thank you to all who have come out today to hear their incredible and inspiring stories. The U.S. Consulate is very proud to co-sponsor this event with the Chinese-Canadian Military Museum Society. We especially want to thank Don Chapman, King Wan, and all their team for their outstanding work in putting this weekend's events together. Thank you also to our hosts at UBC for the setting for today's discussions. The men who will speak to you in just a few minutes are true heroes. They are war heroes, and they are civil rights heroes. They'll tell us about the battles that they fought overseas, for which some of them are our most decorated heroes. They'll also tell you about the struggles and battles that they faced at home for equal rights. This program is special and unique for many occasions, for many reasons, and one of those is the connection that these two groups share. The Tuskegee Airmen and the Chinese-Canadian veterans struggled against severe prejudice and faced similar discrimination, all while serving selflessly and bravely in some of the most dangerous battles of the last century. Today, we're here to recognize not only their courageous achievements, but also acknowledge their heroism in the face of prejudice and the positive change they helped to bring about. So your commitment, your dedication are truly inspirational, and your stories need to be heard, not only by your contemporaries, but by the younger generations. Civil rights and freedoms, so basic to young people in Canada and the United States and the U.S. today, are sometimes taken for granted. Your stories will show them that, in the words of the United States Air Force Colonel Walter Hitchcock, freedom is not free. So this is a historic occasion, the first time these two groups are meeting, and I am honored to be a part of it. So on behalf of Consul General Anne Callahan, the United States Consul in Vancouver, a very special welcome. Thank you, not only for traveling to be here with us today, but also for the battles that you fought, the values you stand for, and your willingness to tell your stories to us today. Thank you.
We are also honored to have a member of Parliament here, Joyce Murphy, if you wouldn't mind, or Murray, rather, if you wouldn't mind coming up, and she would like to welcome you here.
Well, thank you very much, Don, for the invitation to be here to acknowledge all of the participants on behalf of the Parliament of Canada and the Liberal Party caucus. So it's a great pleasure. Just to let you know my personal connections also, as a Canadian, I was born of an American mother. So I joined the Canada-US Parliamentary Association, and part of my work in Parliament is the kind of bridge building that has been so important for the great friendship that our two countries enjoy today. And I see this event as another one of those important bridges of understanding and love between our two countries. So primarily, though, I want to acknowledge and recognize the Chinese-Canadian military veterans and the Tuskegee fighter pilot veterans for your heroism. And these are two groups who demonstrated the utmost courage and patriotism in a way that has helped overcome discrimination in a very tangible way in each of our two countries. So congratulations and my deepest respect and appreciation for your contribution to the history of our countries. And lastly, I want to acknowledge, I would like to acknowledge King Juan chairing this, Don Chapman, of course, Colonel Hao Li, the other members of the committee, the Chinese-Canadian Military Museum Association for initiating this very important dialogue. Thank you for what you're doing to bring these important veterans and contributors to our countries, to bringing them to public awareness and recognizing and respecting and honoring the contributions they've made. So thank you very much, everyone, also for participating.
Now let me tell you how I kind of got involved in this. This isn't about me, and it's not about my issue, but I've been fighting the Canadian government for decades on an equality of rights issue and citizenship. And because of discrimination in Canada, I lost my citizenship. I recently got it back, but we're still in a battle. We go to court in less than a month for equality of rights right here in Canada. I was a United pilot, and I was one time in the simulators, and the instructor said, "I'd sure like to get out of here by 7 o'clock this evening." And I said, "Why?" He says, "Because there's a meeting of the Tuskegee Airmen." And I looked at him and I said, "You mean the real Tuskegee Airmen?" He says, "Yes." I said, "Can I go?" That was my first introduction. It was in Denver. The next time was an event that was in Mesa, Arizona, and I was lucky enough that Bob Ashby was there. And I walked up to him with my wife, and he introduced, or we got to know each other. And Bob asked me to attend one of their functions. They have a branch of the Tuskegee Airmen, a chapter in Phoenix. So I ended up being part of that chapter and becoming a member. And what an honor it is to be a member of that group. And the wonderful, the absolute wonderful things they do, and for children, and to educate people, and to enlighten people. And then, with my battle with the Canadian government that it was ongoing, I was asked by King Juan one time to be a guest speaker at the Chinese veterans here in Vancouver. And as I was talking and telling them about some of the discrimination that I had seen with the Chinese, very quickly they expanded on that, and I became not the lecturer, but I became the student. And it was absolutely fascinating listening to their stories, and before I realized that in my mind, I'm starting to compare the two groups, and I'm realizing that no country has an exclusive on stupid, and that discrimination, unfortunately, tends to go with the human race. But I also realized that these two groups needed to meet each other because they share common stories, not just what they did in the war, but what they did afterwards. And it was very ironic because the Tuskegee Airmen's motto was the double V for double victory. The Chinese were one war, two victories. It meant the same thing. And again, this court case I'm doing in a month from now has a great deal to do with discrimination and the Chinese history in Canada. So I wish I could say that it was all done and finished, but on both sides of the border, actually probably anywhere there are two human beings, discrimination rears its ugly head. Anyway, I'd like to start by asking Dave Tolliver a question. Dave is our chapter president, and Dave, we all stand on the shoulders, if you will, of these Tuskegee Airmen and the people. We're their beneficiaries. And there's a microphone right up here, Dave. And in essence, not only were we the beneficiaries of what they did during the war, but we're the first generation beneficiaries, but we're the beneficiaries of what they did to our respective countries. Dave, how does it feel?
Thank you, Don. I followed a brother who followed a brother to Tuskegee, and we had the distinct privilege of being taught in the classrooms and trained on the drill fields on how to be an Air Force officer. But more than that, they taught us how to be men. And I'd like to simply say that they were not virtual examples. These men were real examples. So much of what I am today, I attribute to the men whose shoulders I stood on.
Thank you. You know, that was another thing, because obviously I'm not black and I'm not Chinese. But I was in the majority, if you will, being white. And something just absolutely stood out with me, and that was that anybody that's in a minority, whatever that minority happens to be, has no chance ever of gaining equal rights or advancing unless somebody in the majority crosses over and says this is wrong. And I'm a hybrid, if you will. I grew up in the United States. Canada canceled my citizenship when I was 6, and I got it back when I was, I think, 52. So I spent a long 47 years. I became a hybrid. And if I could say anything, I guess I would look and say, I wish the Americans were more like the Canadians, and I wish the Canadians were more like the Americans. We can learn from each other. The one thing on Canadians that I'd say is the greatest attribute is they're so wonderfully nice, and the greatest detriment sometimes is that they're so wonderfully nice. I would like the Canadians to be a little more forthcoming in standing up and saying, hey, I see something wrong, I'm going to stand up. I guess everybody should do that, not just in one country. Everybody has an obligation to stand up when they see an injustice. I would like to take a moment, and I'm going to introduce the Tuskegee people, and Colonel Charles McGee. I mean, it's hard to even know where to start with people like this. Just incredible resume. My parents, one of the things they tried to instill in their children was to leave this world a better place. Well, I'm looking at all these folks here, and that's exactly what they've done. And nobody did it better than Colonel Charles McGee. He was born in 1919. He went to the University of Illinois. He got his Silver Wings and commission as a second lieutenant in 1943. He entered the class in Tuskegee, I believe it was 43F. He has 6,100 hours as a pilot. He's been involved in 3 combats, World War II, the Korean War, and Vietnam. He's flown 409 missions. That's the highest 3-war total of anybody in the United States Air Force. Sitting, yeah. I mean, it's really something, being in my position to sit and actually be standing next to your heroes. I mean, that's just something. Next to Colonel McGee is Lieutenant Colonel Robert Bob Ashby. And again, he's the first gentleman I met that kind of got me involved. He was born in 1926. At 17, Bob enlisted in the Army Air Corps. He graduated from the University of Maryland. He's flown P-17s. Was it an AT-6, I believe? And then B-25 bombers. He was in the Tuskegee Class 45H that graduated in 1945. Right after graduation, they sent him to Japan, but the problem there was they sent him into an all-white group, and they wouldn't let him fly. The problem was it was segregated. Eventually, he ended up back in Ohio in a black unit, and then Truman ended up integrating the Air Force. Bob got hired by United Airlines, and this is something I find absolutely despicable. Bob has all these qualifications as a pilot, and they wouldn't hire him as a pilot. They'd hire him as an instructor. Bob should have been a very senior United Airlines pilot, but because of his color, they put him in as an instructor. Now, he was probably a fabulous instructor, but he should have been hired as a pilot. Finally, in 1973, Frontier Airlines hired him, and he was the, I believe, first Tuskegee Airman that was a captain for a U.S. airline, and he retired, I believe, 1986, if I'm correct, Bob? Sitting next to Bob. Yeah. Sitting next to Bob, you know, again, we've become very good friends, is I'm sorry, we've got it mixed. I've got my notes mixed. Let's go to the next one. It was Bill Norwood. And Bill Norwood, I was a brand new pilot with United Airlines, and I had a problem, and the captain that came to my rescue at the time, and he didn't have to because, I mean, I'm brand new, I'm on reserve, was a guy named Bill Norwood. Isn't it ironic that 25 years later, I run across Bill, and what goes around comes around, and I've always remembered that he stood up for me. Bill and I, well, we've also become good friends, but Bill went into the U.S. Air Force and flew B-52s. Bill got hired by United Airlines as the first African-American pilot at United. He flew for 31 years. And he retired flying the DC-10, and that's where I met him. I was trying to jump seat on the DC-10. He has been involved with the Museum of Science. He graduated from, was it the University of Illinois? Southern Illinois. He's sat on their board of trustees for many years. Bill has something else going for him. Maybe some of you saw the movie recently, 42, or it was titled The Jackie Robinson Story years ago, about the first gentleman who's black and made it into the Major League Baseball. Well, Bill was the first black collegiate quarterback in the United States. They might let people play in different positions, but not quarterback. Bill broke that barrier. Yeah. And Bill Norwood is a founding member of the Organization of Black Pilots, and I can tell you, also a really decent guy and a good friend. With that, sitting right next to him is Colonel Dick Tolliver. Dick graduated, and you saw Dave, his brother, from Tuskegee University. He entered the United States Air Force in 1963, and he was in the Vietnam conflict in 1966. He's flown in Thailand, Europe, Southeast Asia, North Africa, and the Persian Gulf. Dick was telling me when he was, under 10 years of age, there was a knock on his front door in Alabama, and it was the Ku Klux Klan that showed up to lynch his father. How does one ever get over that? And, we've shared some good stories together because I was very angry at the Canadian government for canceling my citizenship, and Dick has every reason to be angry. And now I probably should be thankful to the government because I've met so many wonderful people, including all of these people on the panel. But I look at Dick, and he too has taught me a lot about getting over anger. And he, instead of channeling it into anger, he's channeled it into helping people and enlightening people. And so what a pleasure it is to have the Tuskegee folks here. Let's all of them. Now, King, if you would come up, please, and introduce our Chinese veterans. Thank you.
Good morning. That was very touching to hear all those, stories about our visiting friends. As you know, I'm not Larry Wong. Larry Wong's name is on the program, and he is the curator of our Chinese Canadian Military Museum Society. He was supposed to give this, talk about our Chinese Canadians, but he is now tied up in the museum, getting it ready for this afternoon. So I'm sitting in for Larry at this point. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce you, our veterans here, at this forum. On my immediate right is Colonel Hao Li. Colonel Hao Li is the founding president of the Chinese Canadian Military Museum Society. That was formed in 1998. It is now 15 years since that society was established, and we do have a museum in Chinatown. Now, because of Colonel Li's efforts and all of the veterans at the time, he was able to get that museum going. And the purpose of that is to educate and to share with Canadians the Chinese-Canadian history in war and in peace. And Colonel Li has been involved in the military for over 35 years. He commanded the 12th Service Battalion, and also now is a special advisor to the 39th Service Battalion and an honorary colonel there as well. He has done many things in the Chinese community. He has been the president of the 280 Anavets in Vancouver and has served on the Chinese Cultural Center, Colonel Li. Sitting next to Colonel Li is Neil Chan. Neil Chan joined the military in World War II after the time that when the Canadian government relaxed the rules and allowed Chinese Canadians to serve. And he had joined Force 136. Force 136 is an organization that trained Chinese Canadians to work behind enemy lines. In Canada, there were 3 locations where they actually were trained. And Neil served in Southeast Asia during the war. And I'm sure that he can tell you a bit more about his exploits when he was over there. Next to Neil is Frank Wong. Frank Wong joined I guess, the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineering as an engineer. He had served overseas in Normandy, and he actually was in the group that was supporting the artillery as they moved into Europe. He fought all over Europe during Second World War, and then at the end of the conflict, he was part of the Canadian contingent that liberated Holland. And he's been over to Holland a number of times to help their celebrations of VE Days in Europe. Frank Wong. Last but not least is George Chow. George Chow had an interesting career in the military. He also joined at the same time around the time when Frank was involved. And he is an artillery person. He actually was trained in Canada and then was sent overseas to the UK. His unit in artillery was in support of many of the units that was sent overseas to invade Europe from Normandy. And George, too, has served many years in the military. And when he returned to Canada, he joined the Reserve 15th Field Artillery until his retirement. George Chow. And now I turn the podium back to Don for the next segment of this presentation.
At this stage, it's time for me to shut up and let these people talk. So I'd love to start this, and we're going to start with Colonel McGee, and he'll give a little history from his side on the Tuskegee Airmen. So, Colonel McGee, thank you.
Thank you, Don. Ladies and gentlemen, an introduction to the Tuskegee Airmen. But they said I only had 15 minutes. It might take a little longer if you want the whole story. but we'll give you that capsule. Really, I look at the experience in 5 phases, but there's a prelude to that, to those 5 phases of the Tuskegee experience. The prelude would include a young lady named Bessie Coleman, who had to go to France in 1920 to get a license because of her love of this new industry, aviation. But she came back to America in 21 and spent the next few years of her life barnstorming, but introducing this new phase of aviation to around this country and influenced the black experience in aviation. That becomes very important in the story of the Tuskegee Airmen. She lost her life in 1926. But in 1925, our Army War College was doing a study of how to use this 10% of the American population if the country got involved in war again. This study by the War College concluded that the Negro American was physically qualified, and that meant excellent work in digging ditches, cooking food, driving trucks, you name it, service role. But leadership qualities and so on, they did not have that capability. So therefore, their recommendation to the Army was, yes, use this portion of our population, but in segregated units because blacks and whites can't work together successfully, and in service roles. The War Department bought that, and that became policy. 1939, America's going to support England and what's going on in fighting Hitlerism in Europe. That support said we need to build up our units, we need to provide the war-making materials. So there's quite a change around the country, and all of us Americans were interested in taking part. However, this Army policy of segregation affected that. 1939, civilian pilot training program was established to get a pool of pilots that our military units could call on as they built up their preparation to participate in the war. this program was at black colleges around the country. And at first, none of the so-called black colleges, primarily across the South, were included. But pressure is on. They finally, some 5 of those colleges participated in the civilian pilot training program, had excellent success. But some of those getting their license in the civilian pilot training program, going next door saying, I want to be an Army pilot. The Army said, oh no, we have a policy that denies that opportunity to you. Of course, they didn't tell you that. They just said, no, you can't be a pilot. They told a young man who graduated in 1936 from the Army War College, B.O. Davis, Jr., I want to be a pilot. Sorry. The answer to him was, we have no black units. In other words, even as an officer, he was not going to command any whites. Again, that policy that success can only be attained in segregation. Well, still the need, still the goal. Finally, the first phase of the Tuskegee experience came about when the Army said, well, we'll experiment. We've studied the issue. We know it won't work, but we'll authorize a squadron, 99th Pursuit Squadron. Fine print said, and I think earlier somebody said a squadron, 30 pilots, 24 aircraft. Fine print said, and all of the necessary support. Support for that squadron, close to 200 technicians, mechanics, and those that actually maintained the aircraft and allowed us to fly. But in segregation, another couple hundred that had to include medics and communications, supply, administration, and all of the support work. The Army had said, part of that answer to B.O. Davis, we can't use a black pilot because we do not have any black mechanics. So really the first Tuskegee Airmen folks were the mechanics for this 99th Pursuit Squadron, trained at Chanute Field, Rantoul, Illinois, starting in 1940. Wow. These mechanics did well. They said, gosh, we need an airfield if we're going to train pilots. They found $4 million to build Tuskegee Army Airfield for this segregated program. 99th Pursuit Squadron is the first phase of the Tuskegee experience. Combat ready in December of 43. Army had a problem. No white commander wanted a black unit. They continued training for another 3 months before they said, well, we'll send you to North Africa, attach it to the 33rd Fighter Group. No, you go to your own base. They didn't go to the base of the 33rd Fighter Group. Colonel Mummeyer didn't want them, didn't like them. His reports were, they're not aggressive. They've only shot down 1 aircraft. Should be patrolling Liberia. Hope you look at your map and see where Liberia was. Well, the war continues, coming out of Africa into Sicily, out of Sicily into Italy. Folks, there was one little bit of integration in the Tuskegee experience when the 99th was then assigned to the 79th Fighter Group. Bill Bates, different attitude. More pilots do the job. 99th in a 7-day time frame shot down some 16 or so German aircraft. My gosh, given the opportunity, they can fight. Army didn't change the policy, folks. In the meantime, they're going to need replacement. Second phase of the Tuskegee experience. 3 additional squadrons, 100th 301st and 302nd became the 332nd Fighter Group. Combat ready almost in the P-40 like the 99th, but they said, oh, you are going to do some patrol work. Switching us to the P-39 Bel Air Cobra. Leaving the States, ending up directly to Italy in January of 1944, flying, patrolling Naples Harbor and the waterways up to the Angio beachhead. Part of that experience goes on because our bombers flying deep into the German territory, losses were tremendous, if you know that history. And so they decided there weren't enough guns on We thought we had enough guns on our B-17s and B-24s to protect them, but that wasn't the case. So they needed additional escort to fight off the German aviation that was taking a toll, sometimes half of the bomber squadrons not returning. 12th Air Force groups were picked to go to 15th Air Force, and the 332nd Fighter Group was one of them, moving from the Naples area to the Adriatic side. P-39 wasn't aircraft. P-47 Thunderbolt was picked up, and the escort work began flying the P-47 Thunderbolt. Only had that, and all those four groups that started the escort work were, by July of 44, flying the P-51 Mustang. That comes in the story of the Red Tails. In 15th Air Force, there was the Yellow Tails, the Candy Stripe, Checkerboard, and the Red Tails. But folks, the Red Tails is only phase 2 of the Tuskegee experience. They performed exceptionally well. When they came home, segregation still existed. In the meantime, when I had graduated in June of 43, my instructor said, "Too bad they don't have a bomber program for you guys, because I think you'd make a good bomber pilot." I don't know what I was doing for him to say that, but I was enjoying flying. But medium bomber training began at Tuskegee Army Airfield, Mitchell B-25. Very important, this phase 3 of the Tuskegee experience, because it was pilots and crewmen of the 477th Bomb Group Medium who, as they began their combat training at Selfridge Field, Michigan, then Freeman Field, Indiana, but again, attitude the commander. Colonel Selway wanted to maintain segregation. How did he do it? Army regulations say officers use the officers' club, serve the facilities of the base. He had General Hunter's okay to say, "Not on my base. Trainees can only use the facilities I designate." Who's in training? 477 Bomb Group, training to go to the Pacific. Officers felt, hey, that's the worst part of segregation because it defies Army regulations. We need to go to the club. They tried entering in 2s and 3s peacefully, were turned away, some put under house arrest. Finally, Colonel Selway called the officers in, said, "Read my regulation and sign this piece of paper that you'll abide by it." 101 refused and were immediately put under arrest, shipped from Freeman Field, Indiana to Godman Field, Kentucky, behind barbed wire guards, all of this. Really treated worse than German prisoners of war at the adjacent Fort Knox. But folks, that's the ending, if you will, or not the ending, but another phase of the Tuskegee experience, because what they accomplished is that now, as we say, double victory. 332nd Fighter Group fought that battle fighting against Hitlerism in Europe. 477th Bomb Group fought that battle against racism here in America. Of course, the hearing that came about proved Selway wrong, General Hunter wrong, but the Army didn't change their policy. So the next phase of the Tuskegee experience is 477th Composite Group, keeping 2 of the B-25 squadrons, reactivating the 99th Pursuit Squadron. Godman Field's too small. Opened up Lockburn Air Base, Columbus, Ohio, now Rickenbacker Air Base. The Composite Group went there. Training ended down at Tuskegee in 46. We were all sent to Lockburn Air Base, Columbus, Ohio. 4th phase of the Tuskegee experience, a wing base operation. Colonel Davis, the commander. Army still didn't change the policy. The Air Force became a separate service in 46 and said this: we need to use our people based on training experience, not the color of their skin, and we're not getting enough money to keep Lockburn open separate but equal to our requirements. We need to integrate. Very courageous president Harry Truman, just a few months later, issued Executive Order 981 mandating that all of the services should integrate. But the fifth and final phase of the Tuskegee experience is reactivation of the 332nd Fighter Group at Larburn flying P-47Ns. Final tidbit, because I could talk quite a bit longer on the total experience. The Air Force sometime later began publishing their history, and in talking about Top Guns, I think all of you know about Top Gun programs. The first Air Force Top Gun meeting was in May of 1949. Historian put down 1949 unknown. Guess who the Top Guns were? Pilots of that fifth and final phase of Tuskegee experience. 332nd Fighter Group flying P-47Ns were the first Top Guns of the United States Air Force. The Air Force carried out their intent by closing Lockburn in July of 1949, and we were scattered around the world. So, folks, all I can ask you to remember, Red Tail's most important, but one victory. 477 Composite Group, and 477 Bond Group and the Composite Group. Second victory against racism here at home. Thank you.
If you'll notice, he's got a medal around his neck. That's the Presidential Gold Medal of Honor. All the Tuskegee Airmen were awarded that. You know, they're here in Canada because when you drop a pebble into the water, a ripple goes out and touches all shores. What you do whenever you try to make life better in one place, you make life better everywhere. And one thing in Canada I noticed is that we don't have as many heroes, if you will. And yet these people came, the Chinese, and it's not just the Chinese, the Indo, the Japanese, I mean, kind of anybody who wasn't white, they too came and faced their own sets of discrimination and double victory. And they too are heroes and deserve to be recognized as such. And they really haven't had that in over 60 years after the war. It's time to recognize them. Colonel Howley, I would like you to give a few minutes and explain your side.
Thank you, Don, and good morning to our government officials, and especially the welcome to our visitors, the U.S. Air Force Group 332. We're delighted that you are here, and I'm just going to give you some background of our group here in Canada so that you have a general idea and relationship so that you may do some comparison. So I'm not going to go much in specifics. I'm sure that you're all willing to hear the details from our veterans. So if I can just give you a broad background of our Chinese Canadians in Canada, one of the larger groups that were brought into our country was the completion and the building of the Canadian Pacific Railway. And the construction started in 1881. It took 4 years to build the most difficult section in British Columbia. That was to deal with all the rivers, the bridges, and tunnels, so that over 17,000 were imported to our country to do that job. And there were high casualty, as you realize. But when the job was finished in 1885, sadly, the company reneged on their promise to help our workers, who were mainly single men and young common labor, so that when the job was finished, they were sort of turned loose and said, you're on your own. They were not assisted to go back to China or to settle in Canada. And with that large group trying to survive here in British Columbia or Canada, then the Caucasians were looking at these people who were trying to survive in the sense of just doing the basic things, because they were not specialists, they were not professional in any way. These were just laborers. So these people were sort of working, and they were feeding themselves and doing laundry and things like that. So that's what they set up when they were in this country of Chinese restaurants, laundries, etc. And as the people were trying to look for work, then the Caucasians here in Canada and BC in particular, saying they were taking jobs away from them, and then they started to petition the government of the federal government in particular, and that's when immediately our group, to prevent any additional immigrants coming in, because many of these had families in China or girlfriends, and they would like to bring them over if possible. But the federal government then decided to restrict that and immediately impose what we call the head tax. And to come into Canada, these new immigrants had to pay $50 per person. Within 2 years, that was increased to $100. That did not sort of prevent what the government wanted. So by 1907, it was increased to $500. In comparison to wages of the day, is like 2 years of work. But many survived and pooled their resources. They were able to continue in this country. And that's how we started to have children from these immigrants. And as a result, these people, the children that were born, were not citizens of the country. They were denied any of the benefits of the country. In fact, these people were normally given a birth certificate, but in addition, if you get to visit our museum, you see another certificate issued by the Immigration Department, which states that this individual do not have any legal status in Canada. So think of your situation if you're a grown child with that background. A non-citizen of the country, you don't have any status. However, they persevered and they survived and continued on until some of them, because they started to age or grow up to military age. During the First War, 1914 to 18, we had about 300 that served for the government of Canada fighting in Europe, and we lost some of them. By 1923, the government was convinced, this is the federal government, was convinced to try to put a total stop, and they brought in the Chinese-Canadian Citizenship Act, and we commonly call it the Exclusion Act. So from 1923, it was pretty well no Chinese came into Canada. And then as the children that were produced, we now approach the Second War, and then there were a larger number of military age. And for frontline people in the military age, it was ideal between 17 about 27 to serve. And our people, the Chinese Canadians, tried to volunteer for service. They were denied because, as many of the other countries around the world, they who find foreigners serving for their country, they automatically give them citizenship. And that was one of the major reasons the federal government of Canada would not accept volunteers of our group. But very quickly, it was the British government that pressured our Canadian government to open up, because very simply, as the war proceeded in Europe and after the Normandy invasion, which you'll hear from a couple here, that they were involved there. So once the Allies got into Europe And remember that behind the enemy lines, there were many of the British and some of the Polish and others working behind the enemy lines throughout Europe. And the leaders realized that they were now going to eventually take all the countries back, including Germany. But the Allies, especially two governments, the U.S. government and the British government, they were heavily involved in the Pacific. And with that background, they were committed, like after Pearl Harbor and the British in India and all the other countries that they had a foothold, like Hong Kong, Singapore. The two governments in particular realized they could not take these secret agents out of Europe and drop them behind the Japanese line. So it was on that basis that the British government realized that an ideal group would be Canadian-born Chinese to be trained for behind-the-enemy line work. And that's how the government opened up for our people. And on that basis, if you look at some of our records, we have approximately 800 that served in the Second War. And when our people were enlisted or joined, they were scattered in just about every unit, and we have record that our people, some were individuals in a unit or a regiment or a battalion. They were in North Africa, they were Sicily, Italy, all of Europe, and then mostly in the Pacific. So that's a quick bit of background of our contribution, and through their effort, we realized, and it was not well publicized, and sort of this is when I came on the scene, I said, you know, our people made very significant contribution that they contributed to the war effort that was not well recognized, and they were, again, their contribution was very significant. So on that basis then, it was when I became involved with our Chinese Canadian veterans, and that's how we started our Chinese Canadian Military Museum. And the purpose there is to record, document, and hopefully that the contribution would be recognized and passed on to future generations. So again, that is very simply our background, and I think I'll pause here and let you talk to some of our veterans. Thanks, Don.
I should say how a little story of how I met Hao Lee. We were going to court in Canada because we had a World War II veteran's son. He was a war bride child, and he was born out of wedlock during World War II. And so the government of Canada, after 60 years, decided he was not deserving of his citizenship since he was born out of wedlock. And by the way, that's what the court case is coming up in 1 month from now. So we won that case, but we have to do it all over again. But I met Hao Lee through that because we were going to Ottawa. We were going to have this huge battle with Ottawa. We wanted to get some media attention. So I called Colonel Lee, and he offered the Chinese veterans to go down to the ceremony. And that's how we got involved with each other, because we both realized the importance of citizenship. I would like to mention another thing that I've noticed is that in times of war, the governments just want to put a warm body into a seat, and you can die for your country, and that's okay. And that's what I've noticed, is that at times when there's discrimination, the time you can advance is in the military, oftentimes. Whether it was Canada, whether it was the United States, or wherever. And that provided an opportunity. I also noticed something else, that the people that went to fight in the war were not just fighting the enemy, but they were trying to prove that they can do the job, and they actually many times took more chances than other people. And many, many times the statistics of their injuries and death were higher because they were trying to prove a point. And they fought harder many times. And for that, I don't know that people recognize that as much. But then they come home, and sometimes you have to ask yourself, why did you come home? You were treated better in Italy. And then the answer I get from that is because we had to make our country better. We had to make it better for everybody. So they came back, and I don't know if Jenny Ueshi, are you in the room? Well, she's Japanese. And there's another story. Right after World War II, the government of Canada put 10,000 Japanese Canadians. These are people born pretty much in Canada. And the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that they could be deported, the citizenship stripped away from them, and sent to Japan. In World War II, or that time frame, the Prime Minister of Canada was Mackenzie King, who had a saying about the Jewish, "One is too many." So we have a very checkered past in Canada, and we don't know our history, let alone the history of this. Trevor. I'll start with Trevor's father. Trevor's father was shot down over France, and I asked Trevor how his father got away, and he says, well, the Germans thought, being Chinese, that he was running a restaurant. He wasn't. He was very much involved in the underground. It's something you don't really think about. And the Chinese were very involved in that. And then later, as Colonel Hao Lee said, they went over to the Pacific, and you talk about putting your neck on the line. And even, Douglas Jung, after the war, he came back and became Canada's ambassador to the United Nations, and the Prime Minister one time walked up to him and said, "Which country do you represent?" It's been very interesting. I'm going to open this up to anybody in the audience who would like to ask questions. We have so many expert panelists, and they can tell their unique stories. And so anybody who would like to take a microphone in the audience, please feel free. Were you, sir?
Upasatani, father of Stablefish, father of all women, Raven tribe, Kanhata, expressing appreciation for the acknowledgement of the territory. My question will be addressed, if it may be, primarily to Colonel Hao Lee, and Frank Wong might wish to speak a bit as well. I would like, if I may, to take us back to the late 1800s and the failure of that corporate entity, the Canadian Pacific Railway, to honor its pledges to the Chinese laborers who, of course, perform much of the most risky work in terms of transportation of unstable explosives and that sort of thing. Colonel Lee, I wondered if you'd care to speak a bit about how Chinese persons and Aboriginal persons in the late 1800s, post-1885, did in fact interact to their mutual benefit. I was quite touched earlier this year listening to the lady who is the Chinese Consul General here, speaking at First Nations Summit at Chief Joe Mathias Center on the North Shore about how when a Chinese laborer, when that life would be lost, that Aboriginal people would undertake to honor those graves, to put wire around those graves to protect them. And my friend Frank, of course, your family has that.
Could you just repeat your question?
Yes, if you'd speak a bit about those interactions in the late 1800s between the Chinese gentlemen who had worked with the railway and how Aboriginal people helped. And I was just going to mention about Frank's family's involvement with an Aboriginal community up the coast. Thank you.
Just a little about the railway in the 1800s
and he wanted the relation of the Aboriginals? Well, again, in terms of the discrimination, as the people were growing up, and many of the seniors from our racial group, that there was this discrimination on a constant basis. It just wasn't a one-time effort. It was consistent even after the Second War. There was a constant of picking a fight, bullying our people, name-calling, and all that. And often, some communities are driven out. And as a bit of a background, where I was born in Armstrong of British Columbia, very close by, there's like an Aboriginal or an Indian reserve. And this is throughout British Columbia and some of the other countries, that the Caucasians, sadly, they have hoodlums. They would gang up on a few individuals and drive them out of town. And often these people sought refuge at the Aboriginal reserve, and it was nice. The Aboriginals always welcomed the Chinese in. So they gave them protection from these gangs of hoodlums. So again, there was that constant type of bullying and things. And in one example, in Vancouver, Chinatown, in 1907, there was the constant bullies from Vancouver that would go into Vancouver, Chinatown and pick a fight. And they would be in numbers. And this one year, 1907, there was such a large group, it reached in thousands. They went through our Vancouver Chinatown and did a lot of physical damage, broken windows, damaged doors, buildings, and they drove them out of the Vancouver Chinatown. So it's the help of the Aboriginals giving our people some protection in many areas.
Just the other day, my wife was doing some research. Colonel Lee was talking about the riots, and people came into Vancouver. Why don't you, can you take the mic for a minute, or no, you don't want to? Okay. We had the Ku Klux Klan here. Am I correct? We had the Ku Klux Klan in Vancouver. There was. And where did they come from? It was San Francisco area, if I remember you telling me correctly. They had come up from the States. A lot of people in Canada didn't know that. We have some fabulous people here. Bob, why don't you, can you just take the mic? Tell us a little about your story.
I don't think this one is working.
Great.
I think the leaders, speakers here from either side have given me a pretty good idea of what the various problems were with their organization and our organization. The one thing that I would like to emphasize a little here is that you've heard the word a couple of times about double V, double victory. Of the Tuskegee Airmen, more than half of the Tuskegee Airmen were not sent overseas. They didn't want them over there. Imagine fighting a war and not utilizing the personnel that you have to help win. But at any rate, those individuals that was left in the States, their primary job was fighting segregation, and they did a tremendous job. We are honored, the Tuskegee Airmen, of being invited here to participate in the events that are going on with the Canadian Chinese here. We consider them bands of brothers, and let them know that our full support is with them, and we will continue to operate and work with them in everything they can do. Bye.
Mr. Chan, if you could just, if that mic is working, say a few words.
Well, a lot of people don't know this. BC is the most discriminating province in Canada because she's the youngest. BC is the youngest province to join the Dominion. And even up to the World War, the population still did not accept Caucasians other than those that are in the Commonwealth. Now, I grew up here in Vancouver, BC, and educated in Vancouver, BC. And when I joined up the Army and the system in BC was still under the old British rule. And we weren't allowed to bear arms, and we didn't want to do that. So the only thing they allowed us to do was to be janitors, cooks, and clean up. But so we didn't. A lot of us did not like that. We want to become Canadians and carry arms. But in BC, they still under the old code of the Commonwealth. They weren't allowed. Outside BC, the rest of Canada, Chinese Canadians could join any unit they wanted to, and nothing was said. Well, we were stood behind about over a couple hundred of us, young lads, and we was going to just sign on just for home defense. But the English wanted volunteers for the South Pacific in 1944, and they recruited about, I don't know how many, about 600 altogether. And we went to England, and we were told that we were going to be reporters. We weren't going to be very much training. And when we went there, we were screened, and a lot of us were separated in different groups. From there, I was surprised to we were joined up not with regular English Army, but with the Force 136 under General Mountbatten in the Middle East, around Malaysia Peninsula. So we went there and trained in India for a while, and there the groups was separated in different groups, and we were sent to different parts of Malaysia. And in 1945, from what I learned, we were going to invade China in the south, the Burma Road, the back part of China. But when we found out, what I found out is that the Americans took over all operations in the Pacific, so our group under the British were abolished, and we were sent to India for the rest of the war. After the war, a group of us were recruited to repatriate some of the Japanese and the war refugees that were caught in the Eastern Theater. From there, we didn't do very much. We just traveled from one station, one port to another, and helped them to just check up how many British citizens and how many Dutch citizens, how many French citizens, and other people. That was not very much we could do. And after that, we were sent back to India. From India, we were sent back to England, and back from England, we were sent back to Canada. All of our group, apparently all of us were sent back to Canada by 1946. But a few group that was in action before the Americans took over stayed behind and didn't come back till sometime in 1960. Oh, I forgot the date. Because I wasn't interested in when to come back. When I came back, I was relieved. I just didn't want to know any more about the war. Thank you very much. But I just wanted to tell you that BC was the most discriminating province in Canada at that time. Because the rest of Canada, there's no discrimination.
This is well noted, the province of British Columbia from the... Yeah, thank you. In 1914, the Komogata-Maru incident, and then in 1938, there was a woman that was born in Victoria, and she left Canada just for a second, like she might have gone to Seattle, came back and they denied her entry under the Chinese Exclusion Act, and went to the Supreme Court, and they ruled that they could not deny her entry because she was a citizen. However, when did the Chinese get the right to vote in Canada? It was after the war, am I correct?
Yes, the official act was passed January 1st, 1947, under the new Canadian Citizenship Act, but the actual election wasn't called until later, or depending on which government, provincial or federal or municipal.
So you fought for your country, laid your life on the line, and couldn't vote. Wesley.
Yes. Thank you very much for coming. Really appreciate your presence here. I just wanted to make a quick mention here. 3 of the gentlemen that are on the panel up there are over 90 years old. One is up to 95 years old, so I think that that's an accomplishment in itself. I just wanted to follow up on a question related to what Lieutenant Colonel Lee was commenting about, is how the Chinese got the vote in January 1st, 1947. You're going to have to forgive my ignorance of American history. Did the blacks always have the vote in the U.S., or was there a process? Like one of the things, if you talk to a lot of the Chinese World War II vets, they were all sort of saying, I want to be, like actually on their birth certificate, there will be a statement that says, this document does not give any rights to the person to the person named in this document. It actually says that right on the birth certificate. Did you always have the right to vote, or was there a process? Maybe somebody could explain that to me.
This is on. Yes, I'm Dick Tolliver, and I bring up the rear of the Tuskegee Airmen experience, having attended Tuskegee and trained by the original Tuskegee Airmen. But I came on the active duty in the early 60s, right in the middle of the civil rights struggle. In fact, much of the civil rights struggle resulted in the Voting Rights Act of 1964 and 65. That has just been readdressed by the U.S. Supreme Court. The answer to the question is no, we didn't. The vote in America as African Americans was a tortuous and a very difficult achievement that was mostly won during the civil rights struggle. But a lot of lives were lost, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears were expended to get the right to vote, especially in the South. There was just a nominal amount of African Americans voting prior to the Civil Rights Act of the 60s. But after that, we were able to vote. But even today, the right to vote by minorities in America is being re-challenged again, and which really talks to the continuous need to continue to fight for equality, rights, and so on. And that's where the generation that I've been part of, as part of the Tuskegee experience, continues. So that continues today.
And having a right and being able to exercise that right are two entirely different things. Yes, sir.
Oh, hi, I'm Kent Spencer from the Province newspaper, here to cover this event. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Great to see everybody here. The Tuskegee story is well known up here from all the documentaries and things on TV, but we know very little about our Chinese-Canadian contributions here, and I'm very interested to learn more and to find out some things that went on. And I guess these are my questions, hopefully for the World War II veterans we have here. It's were you, obviously you weren't segregated when you served. Were you in a supply role? Were you in a combat role? I think some of you said you were in the artillery. Would you be able to tell me what you think your biggest contribution was in the war? So all of those kinds of details. Were your Caucasian comrades, how did they treat you? Were you well treated there, or was there sort of discrimination there? And when you came back, I don't think you had citizenship then, but if you could tell me about that, and how were you received when you came back, and do you feel that there was some appreciation when you came back?
Great. Thank you very much. I was born in Canada in 1919. When I was young, there was considerable discriminations. I didn't have the right to vote. In fact, a lot of if I go to a theater, I would have to sit in the back row. And in fact, some of the swimming pool, they wouldn't even allow us to go swimming. But in 1942, I decided that if I joined the armed forces and show my loyalty to my country, hopefully they would give us the right to vote. So I enlisted in the Army on May the 1st, 1942. After I completed my basic and advanced training, I went overseas to England. There was no discrimination. I feel like I'm a new man there. I was invited to the homes for dinner and tea, and I have no problem whatsoever. And when the invasion started in France, my unit is the 1st Canadian Army Troops Workshop. Our unit is to follow the AGRA, which is the artillery. Usually consists of about 3 or 4 regiments of medium and heavy artillery. The mediums usually pertain to 5.5-inch gun. The heavy is 7.2 and 155 millimeter. We went through France, Belgium, Holland, and into Germany. And then we went back into Holland again. While we were with the workshop, following the AGRA, the artillery, often our unit came under enemy fire. And it was kind of scary, and then when I'm scared, I used to say the Lord's Prayer. Yeah, to calm down. Yeah. I remember when we went into Germany, went back into Holland again, the people were starving. I remember the young kids, they were fighting over the garbage can for food. So we gave them some of our food and everything until our officer found out about it and prevented. He said, "You need your food because we're in the final stage of the war." And at the end of when we were in Holland, I was able to have a leave to Paris. And then we went down to Paris, and then we had to leave when I was taking the train back to Nijmegen. all of a sudden there was rumor that the war was going to be over. So when the train arrived at Brussels, the people were dancing and singing, and so we joined the celebration. And anybody in uniform, they were just strictly swamped with people. And unfortunately, I missed the train going back to Holland, and I was forced to spend the night in Brussels celebrating. So when I went back to the unit, my commanding officer said, "What happened?" He said, I did my best to get on the train, but unfortunately, it's very unfortunately that after the war, my daughter, my oldest daughter, met a German boy, a German man in the university, and after when they graduate, they were married, and then I was talking to my daughter's in-law, and apparently he told me he was in the German army, and I said, "Oh," I said, "That's funny," and I asked him what happened. He said he was in the army and was captured by the Canadian and sent to a prisoner of war camp in Saskatchewan. After the war, he was shipped back to Germany, but he likes Canada so much that he immigrated to Canada. So I asked him, I said, "Where were you captured?" He said, "I was captured at Caen." I said, "When?" He said, "In the month of, in August, 1944. And I said, "That's funny. I was there at the same time with the artillery. Here we're enemy, and now we're good friends." Yeah, I went back to on the 50th anniversary. I went back to Holland to celebrate the liberation, and I remember our tour guide was telling us, he said, "You notice when we go through all these little towns, you notice something different?" I said, "No." And I said, "There are a lot of flags." And he said, "Today is our Queen's birthday." I said, "Yes." He said, "If you take a good look, you will find that there are more Canadian flags than the Dutch flags flying. This is what we think of the Canadians."
Could Hal, could you just very quickly, to help answer the question, were the Chinese in combat, just very quickly if we could, in about a minute, Frank Ho and Quan Lui? That tells they were in battle. Fred Ho, rather.
Number of our veterans that were heavily involved in different campaigns, and this Fred Ho that was mentioned, he was born in Vancouver. The family moved to Eastern Canada, and when he was able to join up, he joined the Canadian Irish Regiment and went overseas into invasion of Sicily and Italy, and sadly he's killed in Sicily. On that basis, we have some geographic feature to name some of our outstanding veterans. And for Fred Ho, we have a mountain at the northern end of Vancouver Island. The highest peak is named for this Fred Ho. So there's a Mount Ho as one of the features.
And Quan Lake.
And there's a famous family here in Vancouver, the H.Y. Louis family, an immigrant, a merchant, a wholesaler. And through that company, they developed to a huge Western Canada outlet in many ways. But during the Second War the family, H.Y. Louis, produced 10 sons. 3 of them were of military age and they served. One was in the Air Force, the other 2 were in the Army. And this Quan Lui, filing officer, Quan Lui, they were doing the bombing run from England to Germany. And he was about 3 missions short before returning home, so that sadly when they were doing the bombing runs, because the Allies would send 30, 50 bombers or higher numbers at a time. And sadly, he was flying our Canadian Halifax bombers. His happened to be the tail one in the group. They had cloud cover when they went in at the beginning, and when the propellers broke up the clouds, that's when all the searchlights and all the guns brought his plane down. So he was killed in action. He's buried in Berlin. And for that basis, our group, we were able to get a lake north of our watershed named for him. Quan Louis is the individual. The lake is Louis Lake.
Yes.
Thank you.
So, in other words, yes, they were in every theater of the war is the point. And by the way, of the 3 sons of the Louis family, since 2 of them survived, 2 of them got citizenship, and the Canadian government's saying today that the one that died was never really a Canadian citizen. That's part of our lawsuit coming up. That's interesting. Bill Norwood, we haven't heard from you, and then we will get, I see you up there. And so, Bill, I'd like you to...
Just briefly, my career, I'm not an original airman, but I had a principal in elementary school that I met in the 7th grade. He was a Tuskegee Airman, and I respected him so much, and he took me under his wing and became my mentor. And when I looked at him and saw what a great man he was and how the experience had affected him so much, that changed me from wanting to be a doctor to be a pilot. And so I went into the university, got my private license. I went into the Air Force, flew B-52s. Unfortunately, success is built upon preparation plus opportunity. During World War II, we had plenty of aviators, black males, white females who ferried airplanes all over the world, who had the preparation, but they didn't get the opportunity. And I think it's important for all of us to remember that we must fight to make sure everyone has an opportunity to live up to the skills that they have. Because it had not been for the Civil Rights Law of 1964 that was effective in the USA July 1st, 1965, and a lot of people who could not become pilots, not become doctors, not become models, they all fought to get that law passed. And that's the only reason I became a pilot at United. I was not as qualified as Bob Ashby, but the opportunity was not there when Bob was there. So we have to make sure that we have an opportunity for everyone. And the other thing is, just because we are part of an excluded group, we do not have to walk on water in order to qualify. One of the things that I found out when I became an airline pilot, they were all white males. They did not hire a white female in the airline industry until 1968. The big thing I found out, I think, is they wanted me excluded from the group because when I got there, I found outstanding white male pilots. I found good white male pilots. And I found a few dum-dums who were airline pilots. And once you get in and realize that, we have to realize outside groups do not have to walk on water to get in the club.
Hear, hear. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, sir.
So, considering that in World War II we're fighting 2 of the most racist regimes, really, Nazi Germany and the Empire of Japan, my question is simply, how did you do it? I mean, it is so hypocritical, the idea of not allowing other people, of other minority groups to fight. Like, how did you face that bald stance of the government? Like, that's my question. I mean, I'm totally overawed and impressed. How did you get through it? How did you tell yourself, I'm going to do this?
Any takers? Bob?
You have to realize that the country is ours also, not just to the white. And we had to prove to them that we are part of this country and we will protect this country and we'll fight for it. Then we will do the things necessary to improve the country. And the main thing is, you look around and all of the previous veterans around, they came out of the service and they're all involved, they're active, trying to change the country to make it a better country. And that's what we're doing, continuing to make this country or your country improve and be a better country. And that's where we start from.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I feel quite honored to be in the company of both Chinese and Afro-American heroes. I almost became part of the Flying Tigers, the Tuskegee Flying Tigers. I was a student in the United States at Municipal College in Louisville, Kentucky, where I was born. And a recruiter came to the school to try to recruit other young black would-be pilots. And my question, I never finished my training because it ended in 1944. We had gone to, and that was one of the questions I wanted to ask the gentleman. He mentioned I think Lockman Air Force Base. I thought that my training, and it was called Link training, it was a black box and an instrument panel, and you learned to fly, supposedly learned to fly, by being able to handle that instrument aboard. But was it not possible that that training that I received, was that not in Dayton, Ohio? Did they have another plan in Dayton, Ohio? Because I remember being in Dayton, Ohio. Was that possible? I spoke to Colonel Tolliver about being part of that plan, but I didn't know until I just heard Lockman mentioned whether it was in Lockman, Ohio, or Dayton, Ohio.
No, the Tuskegee Airmen training, all of it took part in Tuskegee, Alabama. And after the war, then the unit moved out and went to Lockburn Air Force Base, which is in Columbus, Ohio, not Dayton. And they stayed there until the Air Force was integrated in 1949.
Well, I've had a serious mental old age problem because I've been talking about this training that I took to join the 332nd as Dayton. I feel that you've helped me very much because when I tell the story about the Flying Tigers, I will say I had the chance to become one of the Flying Tigers, but I didn't get the training in Dayton. I got it in Columbus, Ohio. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. We don't have a lot of time left, but I've got to get to George over here in just a minute, but Lincoln Ragsdale is standing here, and he represents another angle of this whole thing. Lincoln's father was not just a Tuskegee Airman and a hero in that regard, but these gentlemen hooked up and over time with people like Dr. Martin Luther King, and his parents helped in the city of Phoenix to integrate. They bought a home in an all-white neighborhood. They did everything they could to advance everybody's equal rights. So Lincoln grew up in quite a family. I mean, it's really, really phenomenal family. And Lincoln, please.
Thank you very much for those statements. My question is to the Chinese Canadians. Is when you came back, what opportunities were there for you when you came back after serving? I know you had served the country, but did you were able to get mechanical jobs, or did they still keep you in positions that were more subservient? As one question. because I can tell that the Colonel and many of you are very articulate. The other question I have is, in this experience, which I knew nothing about, the Canadian and how the Chinese were oppressed here, did the black Canadians have an issue in Vancouver?
George?
Being oppressed and through my observation from what you're seeing.
First of all, I like to feel very honored to have so many officers in one room. Thank you, gentlemen. What was the question again? I'm sorry, I didn't miss it.
What opportunities, when you came back from fighting over in Europe, that the Canadians gave you or oppressed you, and such as in America, you would be as an African American, you'd be a college-educated person, but you could never get a job as a teller at a bank. You would have to be a janitor at a bank, or if you were worked at the airport, you had to be a red cap. You'd be a college-educated person, but you would never get an opportunity to be a ticket distributor or something like that.
Well, when I came back, my brother-in-law got me a job, and I was about 120 or 110. And my first job in this place was lifting 100-pound potato and loading a boxcar. That was my first job. But anyway, later on, I got improved myself, got different jobs. But to start with, talk about discrimination, I joined up 3 months short of my 19th birthday in Victoria, BC. I walked in the armories there, and he looked at me. He said, "You want to join the Army?" I said, "Yes." I says, "You want a lot of action?" I said, "Oh, yes," because I was green as grass. And he said, "Okay, we'll make you a DR." I don't know what a DR is or what it entails. So that was for my first position. Anyway, my first walk in there, they signed me up. They sent me to the quartermaster. They sent to get my clothes. First of all, they sent me the medical doctor to examine me. From there, I went to the quartermaster, got my uniform, everything, all that one day. And my parents didn't even know that I joined. So a couple of days later, I went home. And, of course, my mother and dad was very angry with me. And, they always, you worry about your son. If you join the Army, you're going to get killed. So, anyway, I refused to they were going to get me to stay in Victoria, but I said, no, I'm going to go over. So we came to Vancouver about two months later, and we started, of course, the very basic field in that, and we started, in those days, we didn't have any guns. We didn't know what a Beaufort gun was. We had our unit was about 250 people. I was the only Chinese there. Later on, we had 2 black boys, and they joined us when we were in England. We had a couple of First Nation people, but I couldn't find any discrimination as far as I was concerned. We were all buddies. We all looked after each other. And as a matter of fact, there's one fellow from Nanaimo. Sometime we didn't have a mess tin, so we lined up for food. And I would get double portion, saying this is half is for me and half for him, and say we drank out of the same cup. This was really buddy. No such thing as discrimination. So I guess I was very lucky. So we went overseas, and that was when we first saw the guns. We never had the guns in Canada because there wasn't enough going around. The Beaufort's gun there. But outside of that, and then we got over, we had the 2 black boys, and one of them was a big, tall, lanky guy, must be about 6 feet. His name I can all remember, Cumberbatch. And if we were in a static position, the ladies' auxiliary or whatever would put on dance for him. And, of course, in those days, and in the 40s, jitterbug was a craze. And all the English girls were out there dancing with him, and he was a star of the show, you might say. Oh, it was wonderful. But as I said, discrimination, like Frank, he had some. But Frank and I could have been about maybe half a mile or a few blocks away when we were in Normandy. I didn't know Frank till about 2005 when I joined up. We found out that we were that close. To join over there, of course, we went to maneuver. We did the firing and learned to fire the gun. And we went to down in Cornwall. That's where we did live ammunition. And come back. Went up to Scotland, the Cheviot Hills. Then I transferred the heavy artillery, the 4.7 howitzer. We fired the guns up there. But again, it was I enjoyed myself. But then, of course, we got scared when we were in Caen, outside of Caen. The bombers come over, heading over to drop the bombs in Germany, and we were out in the field there. Next thing you know, we hear this whistle. So that's not a very good sign. So we dive in the trenches, and that one particular time I was talking to 3 of my buddies there. They were what they call the Met section. They let out the balloons up in the air, checked the wind, checked the temperature and all that stuff, because we have the heavy artillery. They needed all this information. When the bomb dropped there, I dived in the slit trench, and after things calmed down, everybody was evacuated back to Caen. And it turned out when we came back, we joined back the unit again. The 3 of my buddies, they're all killed. So we just finished talking to them, you know. That was that close. I was just plain lucky. And we got bombed again a second time, and I was talking to the bomber crew there. They said they weren't involved. But anyway, they were mostly British and Canadian bombers. And apparently what it was, that the units had done so fast that the bombers weren't informed, so they dropped the bomb where the Germans were. That's how we got. We got to go twice that bomb than that. It's kind of an eerie feeling, but you go through these, and if anybody say that in the Army that they're not scared, they're lying, because you are scared. Yeah. So anyway, after I come back, I said my first job was working for my brother-in-law. Actually, my brother-in-law got me this job. You know, in the Army, I don't know the American Army, the same thing. There's a job that takes 2 people to do in civilian life. In the Army, you have 4 people. So, you know, you just live the portion of the weight. So that was my first job. Then I got a different job, working in a mill. Never worked for the city till 1945. I worked for the city of Vancouver. And in those days, you had to show your birth certificate, but my birth certificate was registered in my Chinese name. So to get a job, I had to report to sign a form, send it to the government of BC to let them know what my real name was, you know, because all my driver license, my Army record, everything was under my George Chow. But eventually, anyway, I had sent it over, so they okayed it. So I worked for the city. I worked for the city for about 5 years. And then I went for a company. They wanted some people to look after their transportation section. So I was like a fleet supervisor looking after that for a while. So I did all right. And then later on, I worked as a manager of the cruise ship business, the ship that come up from Alaska, that go to Alaska from Vancouver, a lot of from from Seattle, Los Angeles, and New York. So I had the privilege of getting that job. So there's a lot of benefits for that one too. So I ended up eventually as a sales supervisor for one of your big American company, Cargill. They supply all the meat, frozen meat, all that stuff there. So I got the job at their company. So quite a mixed match of different laborers' work, you might say. Okay, all right.
Thank you. We're going to wrap this up because of time. For any individual questions, all these people will be here. You can come down and have your picture taken with them. We have, some Tuskegee shirts, some books, if you're interested. And I've got to recognize our former president and now the Western chapter, the head of the Tuskegee group, Larry Jackson. None of this would have happened without Larry Jackson. Thank you. And another story that really struck me is because Dick Tolliver mentioned about being in the South and what it was like. Dick and I talked one time, and Tuskegee or Selma, Alabama just couldn't have gotten much worse. And a week or two ago was 50 years since Medgar Evers was shot. And that was all part of the civil rights movement. But we have the people here that also helped carry the torch. And, the Tuskegee torch is now coming into Canada, and the Chinese torch is going over here. But one time, Dick's wife, Peggy Tolliver, told me a thing, and this was a law passed in Selma, Alabama, that you couldn't have 3 blacks together on the street. Peggy had 2 children. She couldn't even take her kids in a stroller. I mean, these stories are incredible. And today, I thank you for coming. Truly, we're putting on another event, a couple of more events. You can, we'll be happy to share that with you because this story is ongoing. But it really is for each and every one of you, in your own way, to try to make the world a little better and to carry this torch forward, because these people, we're all on their shoulders, if you will, and we all have children and grandchildren, and we want them too to have a better world. So I think all these people deserve a very much of a standing ovation.